We are fortunate to begin this series by hearing from Dr. Hal Poe, who is Union's very own Charles Colson Professor of Faith and Culture. Dr. Poe is an internationally recognized scholar on the life and works of C.S. Lewis. And in addition to his numerous essays and scholarly articles on Lewis's work, which I should add, just as a footnote, is only a subsection of all of the vast amount of scholarly work that Dr. Poe does in such areas as faith and science, in gospel and theology, and also in Edgar Allan Poe studies. So in addition to his Lewis work in both essays and scholarly articles, Dr. Poe has produced two significant books as part of his ongoing contribution to Lewis studies. These are his 2006 volume called C.S. Lewis Remembered, Collected Reflections of Students, Friends, and Colleagues, this book right here. And secondly, his 2009, The Inklings of Oxford, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Their Friends. This evening, Dr. Poe will be speaking on the subject of C.S. Lewis and the imagination. Now, for much of his life, C.S. Lewis struggled with the relationship between the intellect, or what he sometimes called reason, and the imagination. Before he became a Christian, Lewis found these two aspects of his experience pitted against one another. On the one hand, he found that his mind, or intellect, or reason pointed him toward what he believed at that time were the cold, hard facts about reality. Namely, that God did not exist and that such things as beauty, love, joy, and the good were merely illusions, byproducts of our otherwise wholly material physiology. Thus, he would write in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, that before he became a Christian, he found the two hemispheres of his mind in conflict. Quote, on the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth, and on the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I love, he wrote, I believed to be imaginary, and nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. Close quote. After his conversion to Christianity, Lewis delivered a scholarly address in the 1930s in which he sketched a resolution between reason and imagination that would form the backbone of his later imaginative works of fiction. Lewis proposed that reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Lewis's subsequent work on the subject of imagination and its relationship to reason is rich and complex. Thus, we are honored tonight that Dr. Hal Poe will be sharing his wisdom and his insights on this topic. And having been under the tutelage of Dr. Poe in a number of different venues, I can assure you that you are all in for a treat that will be at once both delightful and provocative in the best sense of that term. Will you join me in welcoming Dr. Hal Poe?
Well, with such a splendid introduction to the idea of imagination, I think we can go on and move to questions and answers now. Did that provoke you? I do appreciate the invitation to be a part of this grand project. We'll have a number of members of the faculty addressing Lewis from different perspectives. And I don't call myself a Lewis scholar. I've sort of accidentally slipped into that niche. A few years ago, just looking over things I had written, I realized that I had quoted Lewis in virtually every book I had written. And they are a bit diverse, but I just find him very helpful in thinking through ideas. And I'm not a worshiper of Lewis, but I see him as a good and healthy model of someone who has his own struggles and his own unanswered questions. And tonight I've chosen a topic upon which Lewis didn't quite finally, in the end, reach a resolution. I think if he had lived another 10 years, he would have written a major book on imagination. he was working his way in that direction, but it's one of the longest projects he was involved in because as a child, imagination was extremely important to him. Now, imagination has not been a popular topic among evangelical Christians the last 40 years or so. Imagination is something that evangelicals tend to be suspicious of, and the whole idea of the arts and artistic expression is a bit imprecise. And exactly what are these people doing? This issue of what is true versus what is imaginary. And that famous quote from Lewis at the depths of his atheism, struggling toward, well, he wasn't struggling, he didn't want to go there, but kicking and screaming, being dragged towards theism. Everything he loved was imaginary, but everything that was real was grim and dull. And this polarity. And I've wondered if evangelicals tend to be suspicious of imagination because of what the Apostle Paul tells us in the first chapter of Romans, warning us against vain imagination. But I would stress that he doesn't warn us against imagination, he warns us against vain imagination. And I think that adjective is extremely important. We can see the difference between belief and disbelief, between righteousness and unrighteousness, and I think it's important for us to notice the difference between imagination and vain imagination. For in the end, we did not invent imagination. Someone else did. The one who created us in his image is the one who created imagination the same way he created rationality. And so tonight is going to be a bit of a ramble rather than a tight, coherent lecture because Lewis never pulled it all completely together. It was a work in progress. And so what I thought I would do is take you through Lewis's life because what with this being the first in a long series of Lewis lectures, I thought it might be helpful just to have a sense of the sweep of his own life and how this issue came up within his life story and how it then appeared in different things he was working on along the way. So let's first think about how imagination fits into who we are as people. If you do a study of the human spirit in the Bible, if you take a good concordance and just go through all of Scripture, you'll find that the human spirit is responsible for several different domains of what it means to be human. The spirit encompasses what we call the intellect or reason or rationality. It encompasses what we refer to as the emotions, the feelings, the affective domain. It includes character, how we measure up to our values. But it also includes the imagination. It's intriguing capacity of humans. It also includes the will. And finally, vitality itself. But notice in this diagram, I have all sorts of lines connecting one another, and our emotions affect how we think, how we reason, and so does our vitality. So if you don't get a good night's sleep and show up at 8 o'clock for your class, you're not going to be functioning on top of your game. But our character also affects our rationality. And all of these are constantly interacting with one another. Now, this is a Greek way of thinking about things. Lewis said that Aristotle was the philosopher of divisions, And Aristotle would like to look at things distinctly, what is unique about each of these things. But a Hebrew approach would look quite differently. If you think of the old chemistry experiment where you take a beaker of clear water and then some red dye, some blue dye, yellow dye, green dye, and pour all of these things into the one beaker and they all mix around. That's really what the human spirit would be more like. It's only the Spirit of God himself who final analysis can make these divisions. So this constant interacting, and Dr. Barnard, you may be dealing with epistemology later this semester, right? So at some point you may say a little bit about imagination, but think with me about how we know what we know, that grand word epistemology, theory of knowledge, though it seems to me the Greek behind that would have more to do with what we believe than what we know, the way we talk about it now. And in the modern world, in the scientific world since the Enlightenment, or I should say in the philosophical world that has affected the scientific world, there's a tendency for us to think of sensory knowledge, empirical knowledge, what we know through hearing, seeing, touching, tasting, smelling. This sensory experience is the real knowledge, and thus anything else is a bit off the mark. But when you think about it, dogs are empiricists. I mean, they know things through their senses, and even anything with nerve endings is an empiricist. And we didn't advance through civilization strictly by our sensory knowledge, did we? It's critical. But something has to do something with the sensory experience. Our rationality does something with the sensory experience. Our emotions do. But Lewis was increasingly aware that our imagination does something with the sensory experience. And so as we go into his life, let's bear in mind that he's working in several different spheres. As a scholar, as a man who's earning a living as a university professor, he's doing his main work, his job, writing literary criticism. And so he produced a number of very important volumes. If he'd never written Screwtape Letters or the Chronicles of Narnia, he would have been important as a literary scholar in the 20th century. Most of his, well, I suppose all of his critical works are still in print. And if you're doing medieval literature or if you're doing Milton, you have to interact with C.S. Lewis. He was doing the children's books. We're familiar with those. We tend to think of his apologetics as his philosophical works, primarily those that he wrote during the war. But until the day he died, he was known in the science fiction community as a science fiction writer. The last interview he gave before he died was for a science fiction magazine. But oddly enough, Lewis, who was highly gregarious, yet very private at the same time, wrote a number of very personal, private, what we would call testimonies in the broad sweep of Christian literature along the same lines as Augustine's Confessions or John Bunyan's Grace Abounding or John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. These spiritual stories of one's own testimony of faith. So against that broad body of work, let's go back to his childhood. He was not an Englishman. He was an Irishman. Grew up in Northern Ireland, grew up in Belfast. This is a photograph of his home. It's called Little Lee. we might call it more properly prodigiously largely. It's a massive pile of bricks. This is a highly artistic photograph. You would think mistakenly that it's a bad photograph taken into the sun, but no, that's art. But it's in this house that he had his early life experience, and his father did not die till he was around 30 years of age. So this house was the touchstone where he and his brother played. His brother was his best friend, and his brother introduced him to the world of beauty and the world of imagination. Lewis said his first experience of beauty was when his brother took a biscuit tin. Now, we would call this a cookie box, but they call it a biscuit tin. And he took the top off of the biscuit tin and he filled it with moss and some little twigs and little pebbles, and he created a toy garden. And imagination is that aspect of humans that accounts for creativity, inventiveness, the ability to adapt, to see relationships. And for Lewis, this was his first experience of beauty. This miniature garden in the top of a biscuit tin. Well, his grandfather was the rector of the nearby church, St. Mark's Church, and it's here that he was christened as an infant. But there at the rectory, the door to the rectory is, lo and behold, a lion. And for Lewis, one of the most important aspects of imagination is the image. Notice it was that toy garden and the vision of the toy garden that struck his imagination, and this complex interaction of beauty, the aesthetic, the other world, all being sparked. And Walter Hooper has suggested that it is this image that eventually gave rise to Aslan. I'm not sure that I buy that. Lewis himself said he'd been dreaming about lions, but then we asked the question, well, where did he get the images of lions to be dreaming about? If you wander around Oxford very long, you'll discover there are lions absolutely everywhere. Carvings of lions just absolutely everywhere all over Oxford. When Jim Veneman and I were doing this book, which is a dandy picture book, Jim Veneman's photography is dazzling. We started taking pictures of lions just to see how many could we find. And we found dozens and dozens, including the dining room of Magdalen College, where Lewis was a fellow. There are little carved lions all over the dining hall. So perhaps this was the image that gave rise to Aslan, but just the very idea of image is important. Now, of this childhood, Lewis says, it will be clear that at this time, at the age of 6, 7, 8, I was living almost entirely in my imagination, or at least that the imaginative experience of those years now seems to me more important than anything else. But imagination is a vague word, and I must make some distinctions. Now, here he is writing early on, before he's reached some resolutions about imagination. So he distinguishes three ways of thinking about imagination. The first sense involves simply the daydream or the fantasy. And this is one reason we can so easily dismiss imagination. Perhaps you're familiar with the daydream or the fantasy. Since this lecture has begun, Many of you have left the room. You've gone somewhere else. You might have gone home, might have gone back to your dorm. Not only might you have gone back to check on something, think about something, some of you have visited tomorrow. Some of you have visited the fall break and done something and come back. Now, this is a very strange thing that we do. Some would say, you're crazy. You're hallucinating, because when you made that journey, you saw things, didn't you? I mean, go back to your room right now. Look at your bed. What a wreck. Shouldn't you have made it up before you left? Now think of that. You're seeing things. Isn't that crazy? You're crazy. You're seeing things. The hallucination. And this is part of the problem with the imagination that Lewis was going to be eventually trying to sort out, because there are, in some cultures, under the Soviet Union, religion was seen as a psychological disorder, the product of hallucinations. And this is the account for the Bible. So there are the daydreams. Lewis said this involves wish fulfillment and egocentrism. Now, a second sense in which we find imagination used is invention. Invention. And he said that his daydreaming as a child trained him to be a fool, but the stories he invented of Animal Land trained him to be a novelist. Now, when he was a little boy, he made up stories. But it's what you don't have to write the stories down, and you don't have to make a little book to go through that same process. And we as children, I hope, all played pretend, played make-believe. And there we were with King Arthur, and there we were with Lash LaRue out west riding the lone frontier. And we are transported into a world that isn't really there, only we're a part of it. And we make up the story as we go along. Well, this is one kind of way invention takes place, but I was listening to the radio today about Thomas Edison taking a fiber of thread, cotton thread, heating it up until it was just a strand of carbon, running an electric current through it, and lo and behold, he had captured light in a jar. And imagination allowed him to see something that did not exist, and yet to bring it into existence. The inventive spark. An amazing thing. We may say a little bit more about that should there be any time left, but I'm dawdling, so let's move along. It also involves that capacity to adapt what already is. And so that adaptation, that development would be the movement from the T model forward to the A model forward to the Edsel. Well, you always have dead ends, and so you back up and start over again. But for Lewis, this wasn't the exciting part about imagination. For him, the exciting part was the third sense, which involved the poetic aspect of imagination that elicits wonder. Elicits wonder. Justin mentioned that I also work in the area of science and religion, and been intrigued that physicists and chemists and mathematicians don't talk about theories or formulas as being true. They talk about them as being beautiful or elegant. And this wondrous dimension. And the intriguing thing is that this highest form of imagination for the writer corresponds to the experience of the most imaginative and groundbreaking of physicists and mathematicians who describe their imaginative discoveries, theories, and equations. And I'll just, of necessity, do a dotted line from C.S. Lewis to 100 years earlier than C.S. Lewis, someone who was writing on this same subject, Edgar Allan Poe. And Poe said that it's not empiricism or rationalism that are the highest forms of knowledge. He insisted that every important scientific discovery, every new breakthrough, from seeing the earth at the center of the universe to seeing the earth traveling around the sun, this incredible shift in the understanding of reality came about through imagination, to see something in a new way, to see what no one else has ever seen before, to understand something that had not been understood, and you don't reach it by a logical progression. It's a sudden breakthrough, and you're seized, and there is an idea. Have you ever had an idea? It's a strange thing, this business of having an idea. Well, for Lewis, in writing, the imagination involves an experience that goes beyond ordinary life to another dimension. Let's look at how his childhood is developing. As he goes along, he discovers northernness or mythology. He was particularly fascinated by Norse mythology, and it gripped him in a powerful way. He tried to characterize this feeling, this experience he had. Notice we've talked about rationality, imagination, but don't leave out the emotions in this intricate, complex interrelationship. And he referred to it as a longing, but it's a longing with a stab to it. In his spiritual autobiography, he called it joy. It can even involve what we might call grief or sadness in this depth of longing. And he experienced this when he came across Arthur Rackham's illustrations to Wagner's Ring of the Nibelungen, the story of the gold that belonged to the Rhine, the father of the Rhine maidens. They were guarding it, and the wicked dwarf Alberic came and stole the gold in order to forge a ring of power through which he could rule the world. Sound familiar? Tolkien insisted the only thing in common between my ring and Wagner's ring is they're both round. Well, so here the Rhine maidens in despair that Alberic has stolen the gold, and so the Rhine maidens are pleading with the gods to help them get the gold back, but there's a problem. Old Wotan has made a deal with the giants that if they'll build him a great fortress, castle, lodge, Valhalla, there in the sky, in the heavens, that they can have Freya as their girlfriend. So the two giants, Fafnir and Fasolt, build Valhalla, and then they come for Freya, and Wotan had neglected to mention it to Freya. And all the other gods and goddesses are upset because Freya's the one who grows the magic fruit tree that they can eat these apples, and that's how they stay immortal. But if she's not there to grow the apples, they're all going to die, for crying out loud. So here's this tragic tale. And so in the end, Wotan goes and gets the ring of power away from Alberic for himself, only he can't keep it because he's made a deal with the dragons. Tell you what, you don't want old Freya. Golly, look at her. She's just all skin and bones, and she'll probably fuss and nag and whine all the time. What you want is gold. We'll give you all Albrecht's gold, and instead of Freya. And so he gives them all the gold, except there's not quite enough gold. It's supposed to be enough gold to completely hide Freya. Only there's just, she's got a top knot there, and it's not enough quite to hide her, so he has to give the golden ring too. And one thing leads to another. There's all sorts of intrigue, misgotten fortunes, and in the end, Brunhilde, can't tell you all about that, we don't have time now, but she's been asleep for 100 years, and she gets wakened by Siegfried, who would be the grandson of Wotan, but I won't tell you how that happened. And so here's Brunhilde. She's getting ready to be woken by the hero Siegfried, only he's pretty ditzy. Anyway, he's managed to kill old Fafnir, who turned himself into a dragon, and got his ring, a ring of power, and also this nifty little helmet that allowed him to be invisible, but that's neither here nor there. But so the Rhine maidens come along and say, oh, Siegfried, won't you give us our ring back? And he said, well, I don't reckon so. And so they say, well, bye-bye, you're going to be doomed. And sure enough, he gets doomed, and he dies, and Brunhilde rides her horse into the fire, and she's consumed in fire, and Valhalla collapses, and it's all consumed in flame. And that's the story of the ring. Well, this... See, 100 years ago, all I could have said was Wagner's Ring, and you'd know the whole story. But now I have to take this extra time to explain it because we're losing our own culture. But anyway, that's the story of Wagner's Ring. The important thing here is it made an impression on young C.S. Lewis. Now, perhaps you noticed that none of these girls have any clothes on. Yeah. And there they are, just cavorting. You know, that's the way they did art in those days. And so here he was in his adolescence dealing with imagination, and he's beginning to understand something about fantasy. It's not real. It's not real. And so the fantasy that a person might have doesn't correspond to reality. And thus what Lewis loved, he was thinking, isn't real. What's real is drab and gray. He went off to school, dreadful place, he thought, and what I want you to notice is out of the background of what is real, Lewis is accumulating the stuff of which stories are made. And we find him writing about public school in the silver chair. To go to public school over in England, he had to cross the Irish Sea. And he has the background, crossing the Irish Sea on the ferry boat, back and forth during his breaks. The voyage of the Dawn Treader is imaginary, but it's made from the gist of the grist of life. And there are the hills of Antrim as he's approaching Ireland. Went away to Oxford, to University College. This is what it looked like in those days. Joined the officer training corps to go to the Great War, fight in the trenches. When he came back, he was a fellow at Magdalen College, one of those colleges in Oxford. His brother and he, together with a lady named Mrs. Moore. We don't have time to go into all of that tonight, but anyway, she was there too. He was taking care of her. She was the mother of one of his friends from the war. And from the back of the kilns, there's a big hill, Shotover Hill, and from there you can see forever. And even though Mr. Morris of Morris Garage, MG, had just built an automobile factory a mile down the road, if you looked the other way, you could still see the pristine English countryside, as you can today. Well, it's in this mix that he's shifting from atheism to theism and from theism to Christianity. When he becomes a Christian, shortly afterward, he writes his first book of apologetics. He does it in 2 weeks, but it is not philosophical apologetics. It's a story. Oh, but not just a story. Give me a break. It's an allegory. And so he takes his model from John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, and he tells the story of his conversion. He calls it The Pilgrim's Regress. But notice the title. The full title is The Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical apology, excuse me while I yawn, for Christianity, reason, and romanticism. Well, now, this was in 1933. In 1933, he had not yet decided enough about imagination to even know to call it imagination. It was not until the 3rd edition of this book that he explains what I really meant by romanticism. I now understand to be imagination. There's something powerful going on with imagination. And in 1919, he'd written to his friend Arthur Greaves. This was in the moment of his highest atheism, his highest sense of there is only the brute universe. I have been so long with Wordsworth and philosophers that I want something mystical, pure, unadulterated imagination. So at this point, he's thinking of it purely as escape from the humdrum. And it's interesting that Darwin began his interest in nature for aesthetic reasons, the beauty and wonder of nature. Remember, he was a theologian. He was trained as a theologian at Cambridge. He was a Church of England clergyman. And he began his journey through this love of beauty. But by the end of his life, his analytical aspect of his vision had destroyed all sense of beauty for him, and it was all just dry as dust. That's where Lewis was at this point. And this is what he writes about in The Pilgrim's Regress, how just the analytical dimension, rationality by itself, divorced from the rest of the human spirit, disconnected from itself, left him just dry as bones. Well, he did that as a little exercise. His main work, something he'd been working on for 10 years, was the allegory of love. This is his masterpiece, a study of medieval, allegorical, courtly love poetry. Now, remember, if you ever knew it, that for 1,000 years, if anything were written in the West, it was allegory. All the poetry was allegorical poetry. All the sermons were allegorical sermons. And this was the world of the medieval period. It was reflected in the other arts. Statues were stiff and symbolic. Painting was flat and lacked perspective. Not because they had forgotten how to do perspective, but because the worldview had changed and they were intentionally not doing representational art because they were wanting you to think of the other world. And this was what allegory was doing. Everything represented something else. And so Lewis observes in this, as he's writing this massive study, and it's during this study that he converts to Christianity. Under the pretext of allegory, something else has slipped in, and something so important that the garden in the Romance of the Rose itself, one of the great medieval poems, the Romance of the Rose itself is only one of its temporary embodiments, something which, under many names, lurks at the back of most romantic poetry. I mean the other world. Not of religion, but of imagination. The land of longing, the earthly paradise, the garden east of the sun and west of the moon. Now, Lewis argued that poetry always had the world of fact and the world of religion in every culture. It had those two worlds. But in the revolution of allegory, we see that third world of imagination appear. He wrote, "We are apt to take for granted that a poet has at his command, besides the actual world and the world of his own religion, a third world of myth and fancy. Such were the three worlds which Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton were born to. London and Warwick, that's the real world. Heaven and hell, the world of religion. Fairyland and Prospero's island, this world of imagination, the other world. Each has its own laws and appropriate poetry." Now, of the slow process that created this third world of fancy in European literature, Lewis explained, and he's going to go back to the period of the late Roman Empire, when Romans had lost confidence in their gods, when the Greek philosophies, the different mystery religions were all rivals, and finally Christianity emerged in this wild hodgepodge of pluralism. It emerged as the integrating faith of the late Roman Empire. They'd ceased to believe in the old gods. The old gods, when they ceased to be taken as gods, might so easily have been suppressed as devils. That, we know, is what happened to our incalculable loss in the history of Anglo-Saxon poetry. Only their allegorical use, prepared by slow developments within paganism itself, saved them as in a temporary tomb for the day when they could wake again in the beauty and acknowledged myth, and thus provide modern Europe with its third world of romantic imagining. And when they rose, they were changed and gave poetry which poetry had scarcely had before. Let us be quite certain of this change. The gods, and of course I include under this title that whole hemisphere of magic fiction which flows indirectly from them, the gods were not to paganism what they are to us. Now, what's he talking about? In allegorical medieval poetry, they would talk about Mars and Venus and Bacchus and all the gods. They didn't believe in them. They became representatives. Bacchus was representative of drunkenness and revelry. Venus was representative of love. Mars was representative of war. They were emblems. They were symbolic. They represented emotions, inward emotions. And so they were useful up until the 20th century. And so the raven perches upon the bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, and continued really until the 20th century, and now we've lost a few thousand years of culture. Well, we'll move on. Of the imaginative use to which modern Europe would put the old gods of Rome, Lewis observed, "No religion, so long as it is believed, can have that kind of beauty which we find in the gods of Titian, of Botticelli, or of our own romantic poets." Now, what's he talking about? Botticelli. Who's had Art 210? Okay, what's he talking about with Botticelli and the beauty of the gods of antiquity? Any honor students have the beauty course? What's he talking about with Botticelli and a goddess? Venus on the half shell. Exactly. Venus come full out of the sea on the shell. And he's saying these were imaginings that you'd never do of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That would be profane. And you don't do that about your own gods. No. These have now entered into a different world. They don't belong to the world of religion. These gods now belong to the world of imagination. There's been this transfer. Now, the problem with this narrow understanding of imagination in relation to gods, however, lies in the charge that deity itself is merely a figment of our imagination. You see the danger there? And this would have been what Lewis would have bought into early on. It's just a story. Emphasis on the just. Just a story. Let's go forward. This is that the diagram, the map of his wanderings, the Pilgrim's Regress, and his progression to Christianity. The time he's now writing the Allegory of Love and the Pilgrim's Regress, he's taken up with a group of friends, all of whom are dangerous. They're all Christians. These were the ones who had a big influence on his conversion: J.R.R. Tolkien, Hugo Dyson, Lord David Cecil, a few others, Neville Coghill. They meet weekly to talk about what they're writing, read from it. So let's go down to the war. Okay. In the period leading up to World War II, while Chamberlain was negotiating with Hitler, Lewis began writing science fiction. During the war, he would expand his fiction writing, and by the 1950s, he was known as a fiction writer in several genres. He's doing science fiction, children's stories. He's got this, probably his best literary work of fiction, Till We Have Faces. Lots of different things, but also these humorous things like the Screwtape Letters and The Great Divorce. Light fiction. In describing how stories came to him, however, Lewis stressed the phenomenon of visual images within the imagination. He said, with me, the process is much more like bird watching than either walking or building. I see pictures. See, he's as crazy as you are. He sees things. Some of the pictures have a common flavor, almost a common smell, which groups them together. Keep quiet and watch, and they will begin joining themselves up. If you're very lucky, I've never been so lucky as that, a whole group might join themselves so consistently that there you had a complete story without doing anything yourself. But more often, in my experience, always, there are gaps. Then at last you have to do some deliberate inventing. Now notice he's got one aspect of imagination that sees something, but now he's going to have to invent. And inventing a story is like inventing a light bulb. You have to see what has never been before. You have to tell a story that has not yet happened. So it's an intriguing thing. He went on to explain in another place, one thing I am sure of, all my 7 Narnia books and my 3 science fiction books began with seeing pictures in my head. At first they were not a story, just pictures. The Lion all began with a picture of a fawn, see, I'll bring that up in a moment, carrying an umbrella and parcels in a snowy wood. This picture had been in my mind since I was about 16. Then one day, when I was about 40, I said to myself, let's try to make a story about it. During the war, he's got a lot going on. His war work is what we usually think of as his apologetics. He wrote The Problem of Pain. He did his radio broadcast that became Mere Christianity. He did the initial work for the book that became Miracles, and these are his more philosophical apologetics. But he was also doing other things. He was doing some preaching. He was going around to Royal Air Force camps, talking to the men. This is... you may think that's a bad photograph. This is actually art. I'm working on shadow here. Notice how I've grasped the shadow. Well, he was in church one day at his own church. Have you ever been in church one day at your own church trying desperately to pay attention to the sermon and it's not going to work? The main reason we go into the ministry is so we don't have to listen to other people preach. So here he was, and, just feeling awful about the temptation for his mind to wander, and his mind wandered about the struggles of the young devil trying to tempt somebody to get his mind to wander. And one thing led to another, and he wrote his brother Warney about this and how he came up with the idea of screw tape. And here's his drawing of what he imagined screw tape to look like. But notice the invention. He didn't decide to write a book about a devil. He'd been working on Milton's Paradise Lost, and he wrote a very important book, a preface to Paradise Lost. And that whole issue of temptation and the story of Adam and Eve and Satan and the fall. And in the grist of the mill, the overflow spewed out without any planning as screw tape. This idea of pictures, he had in his mind the idea of floating islands. Now, what in the world is that about? And what kind of a world would it be that had floating islands? Well, that was the beginning of Paralandra. And once again, the background, he'd been working on Paradise Lost. And this is a retelling of Paradise Lost with the supposal, what would it be like if Adam and Eve had not succumbed to the temptation? And so imagination is allowing him to create a world that doesn't exist, to create a scenario that did not happen, and an entire storyline of what it might be. Or suppose you could take a day trip from hell to heaven. Day trip believer, however the tune goes. And that's what's going on here. He doesn't imagine hell as it's come down to us in all of the other imaginings. Dante imagined a picture of hell, and that's had a huge impact on popular theology. But he's imagining something that is not so. And he's not claiming it to be theologically true, doctrinally true, I should say. He's saying, suppose this could happen, which is to say, this isn't what happens. But suppose it did. What would that be like? And during his war work, he went up to the University of Durham to lecture on the abolition of man, which, if you'll recall, is that relationship between rationality, character, and emotion. Three aspects of human spirit. But along the way, we realized that Lewis was constantly in the company of castles and the medieval past. The bishop's palace at Durham, which now houses the University of Durham, is an old castle. And so, again, from his life experience, he was finding the pieces and the parts to put together in creating Narnia. During the war, there at the kilns, their home, Lewis and his brother and his friend's mother, Mrs. Moore, took in children who were evacuees from London. That is, while the bombs were falling, many families sent their children to the countryside to be safe. And Lewis and his household took in children. Again, bits and pieces that would be part of the Narnia story. And there you see that image of a fawn with an umbrella and parcels in the snow, along with Lucy. And Lucy was, in fact, one of those young girls who stayed with them at the kilns. She was a real person. Well, let's move towards wrapping it up. He left Oxford during the midst of writing his Chronicles of Narnia to go to Cambridge. He was elected to a professorship, which was an important thing to have. Here in the United States, everybody's a professor if they teach at a university. You're either an assistant professor, an associate professor, or a professor, or a university professor. Everybody gets to be a professor. Just like in Lake Wobegon, everybody's above average. But in Oxford, very few people are ever a professor. And there are certain privileges with being a professor. The biggest one being you don't have to have any students. Well, who would want that? Well, anyway, so he's off to Cambridge, but the year he writes Surprised by Joy, he is also surprised by joy. And this weird situation that he falls in love with a woman named Joy and marries her. And she becomes his muse in writing the novel he'd tried for nearly 30 years to write, Till We Have Faces. He tried 4 times to write it, couldn't write it, but he hadn't been in love with Joy before. And so now he knows things he never knew before. There's some things you cannot imagine. And being married to Joy Davidman was one of them. He wrote The Four Loves. He now knows more about love than he knew before. And he wrote A Grief Observed. Because he knows more about love, he knows more about grief when she dies. Well, let's think about what we can pull together. About the time he was meeting Joy, about the time he was writing Surprised by Joy, he was also in correspondence with his great friend Dorothy L. Sayers, a most formidable lady, one of the great Christian apologists of the 20th century, and one of the dandiest detective writers that's ever come along. And Lewis kidded with her that a few hundred years from now she'll be known primarily for her great art at writing letters, and people will be surprised to learn that she also wrote all of those other books. But they were great correspondents, and in his correspondence with Dorothy L. Sayers, we see his final thinking about imagination. My speculation is he did not move forward to writing the great book on imagination because his life had taken a turn and he was preoccupied with other things. I mean, he had so much to do. His wife was dying of cancer, and he was finishing up his scholarly work. He produced a number of scholarly books during this period. His Oxford History of the English Language in the 16th Century, excepting drama. A Study in Words, Reflection on the Psalms, a number of essays on medieval literature, the Discarded Image, An Experiment in Criticism, and the lectures that were then published after his death on Spencer. So he's very busy, but listen to what he says about imagination. Remember, earlier he talked about 3 dimensions of imagination, and it was still related to that which isn't real. Of the uses of imagination, Lewis now mentions its use by the Holy Spirit. the use of imagination by the Holy Spirit. And if we understand the imagination as being the creative work of God, just as the intellect and the emotions and the will and life itself are the creative work of God, it's all at the disposal of the Holy Spirit. And it is the Holy Spirit who gives visions to people in the Bible. And he's beginning to understand the imagination as an organ of knowledge, just as we think of sensory perception as an aspect of knowledge. Imagination allows us to know things that we could not otherwise know, but it is imagination that God has created within us that provides the access to God, the reception of visions, the reception of voices, to hear things and to see things. In this respect, Lewis seems to believe that the imagination is the human faculty that God provided for the perception of spiritual reality, just as the eyes are the faculty for perceiving physical light and the ears are the faculty for perceiving physical sound waves. And thus, you've got the beginning of a doctrine of understanding inspiration and revelation. Second, Lewis believed that the body uses imagination and the unconscious state to produce dreams. Well, now he's moving into another area of physiology. This is a big area of research now among people who deal with the brain and consciousness and neuroscience and all sorts of dimensions, that there is a vital relationship between the spirit and the body. In the Bible, the term for this relationship is the soul. This dynamic relationship between body and spirit. Third, he believed that our conscious wishes and suppressed fears use imagination to produce reverie in wish fulfillment or fear fulfillment. Yes, all those fantasies and daydreams and that sort of thing. In short, we daydream and retreat to fantasy. Yeah, that happens, no doubt about it. Fourth, Lewis recognized that pathological mental illness uses imagination to produce hallucinations. That doesn't invalidate all the other aspects of the imagination. It is possible for me to add 5 and 7 3 times in a row and get a different answer every time. But that does not disprove rationality. It means I'm sort of like Lewis when it comes to numbers. Isn't that right, Dr. Lunsford? Fifth, Lewis said that the imagination is used by, quote, I don't know what, call it the muse, to produce with or without our conscious volition figments. And gives the example, I thought of Mr. Pickwick. He emphasized the word thought so as to suggest the marvel of the common occurrence of thoughts popping up in our heads without any act of will on our parts. When you have an idea, you don't decide to have an idea. It's not an exercise of the will. It's the imagination doing something. We might call this phenomenon stream of consciousness, which is a current way of naming what we can't explain.